As you know or may know, world physical markets and supply chains during the past 50 years are becoming increasingly interconnected, and things that are going on over in the pond are going to find their way over to the States. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the macro changes going on in the world, how they will affect us in the U.S., and what implications it has on kind of corporate organizational decision-making and organizational design. Energy markets, both electricity and natural gas, are the engine that really drives development and economic health for countries. And as most of you may know, the world is currently evolving not just in electricity and natural gas markets, but all energy markets. And for the past century, most of these global markets have been fairly stable. The energy sources have been kind of vertically defined to specific uses. There haven't been a lot of fuel switching choices over the past 50 years, relatively. And likewise, within a country, manufacturing of products as well as energy sourcing tended to be fairly constrained and limited to that country. But over the past few years, really the into the 2005, 2006 type time frame, the segregated model has really shifted, where there's rapid structural changes both within fuel sourcing as well as across regional markets. And these changes are having very dramatic and broad implications for profitability within corporations. Energy remains kind of the fundamental engine, and it will remain the fundamental engine for development and economic health, but policymakers, regulators, producers, as well as end users kind of have vastly different expectations, as you know, beliefs as well as goals with respect to supply, demand, and environmental consequences, and the role of regulatory governmental oversight in kind of scripting some of these global markets. As this global energy landscape becomes transformed, the corporations must not only understand their exposure to all of these effects, they must also craft some kind of coherent strategy and respond to these cataclysmic events that are going on within their market. The dynamic, or the outcome of this dynamic, is unknowable at this time, and it's highly volatile. As countries set renewable target and goals, whether that country is on target or behind, and the scripting that the regulators and government has to try to make up any gap is going to have a lot of volatility in energy pricing. We in the States have been beneficiaries of a low-cost carbon world, and there'll always be cost pressures that'll balance some of the environmental designs and desires of regulators and policymakers. So you've always got that conflict between low cost and a carbon-free world. And regardless of kind of the Paris Climate Conference, I don't know if you guys have been tracking that coming up toward the end of the month, which really has as its goal to set binding and universal targets for every country in the world. And my suspicion is the U.S. and Europe, U.S. more than Europe, is going to get fairly aggressive targets. And if that comes to pass, where those targets become binding, how is that going to affect our companies as well as our kind of individual lifestyles? But regardless of what governments end up doing to re-engineer a low-carbon world, the key goal of a company is, one, it has to recognize the evolving changes. Two, it has to rationalize the implication of those changes on its business model. And then three, craft some type of coherent response. But it's not just the global changes that are going on. As we mentioned, if you look back in our energy past, for the last 100 years, there's been relatively little change in competition for sourcing of fuel, other than maybe building heating, which had choice of say, oil, maybe coal back in the day, natural gas, and power generation. You know, most of the specific uses of fuel were pretty well defined. Although over the past 10 years or so, and then certainly out into the future, you're seeing more and more competition for use of fuel, with natural gas increasingly being considered kind of the staple of the competitive fuel source. But of course, electric cars have gained a toehold and actually started infringing on market share of the conventional automobile. Renewable energy has grown enough within its market share that it's actually material as far as an off-site utility scale generation source. And then of course, dispersed generation, whether it be a conventional cogen type technology or one of the renewable sources hosted on a roof, or even a small-scale wind project, is starting to change the dynamic of utility supply. And in fact, many successful corporations have been proactive in the space, actually taking on the role of a utility, where they get engaged in 100-megawatt off-site renewable plays, or the dispersed generation gets to be a critical kind of skill set they develop within their company to guarantee reliable supply for their portfolio. The global gas market, and particularly in the United States, as you guys have probably heard for several years, has entered and has been in a sustained period of oversupply. And that oversupply is set to grow. And of course, the U.S., starting in about 2017, 2018, is going to be far and away the largest supplier of excess natural gas to the global market. And the beneficiaries of that excess supply is going to be Europe and China. And what that means is the low-cost fuel advantage that we've enjoyed for, last 7-8 years is going to get pressed. And that obviously is going to have implications on all of our electricity and natural gas costs, but also our businesses. We see a continuation of the competition between natural gas and coal. Particularly within the U.S., the latest EPA rules have literally made the most recent coal-fired generation plants non-compliant. So whether that trend continues or the regulatory pendulum swings back more to favor coal generation to some extent, will drive how quickly or how long it takes for coal to be a viable fuel source. And literally the coal guys are fighting for their life. So the implication of these changes are fairly significant for us in the States, as well as, again, on a global perspective. And if that isn't enough, you have lack of clarity, lack of transparency in both state, federal, country regulatory rules. And as I mentioned, the shortfalls or the excesses in environmental targets will drive rapid policy changes with unintended consequences that companies have to be able to respond to on a global basis. The support for renewables globally is generally lessening now that it's reaching grid parity in a lot of different markets. However, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies are taking a very proactive approach to really charting their generation source future and not leaving that decision up to the utilities. Just a few of examples which you may be familiar with: Amazon, Apple, Google, and dozens of other companies have entered into principally 150 megawatt wind deals in Texas, in the Midwest, in California, as well as some utility scale solar projects either hosted within their sites or off-site in different markets, and literally wheeling the power to their regional facilities and kind of either bypassing or working in concert with the regulated or the retail suppliers in the various markets. So globally, companies have basically 4 approaches. They can be proactive, like a lot of the large Fortune 50 companies are. They can be reactive and wait for policy decisions to come down and try to literally compete on price and take advantage of arbitrage opportunities within regions or within countries. 3, they can do nothing, which a lot of companies do. Or 4, take a balanced approach. And it tends to be kind of a hodgepodge of solutions that companies take. The challenge with the either do nothing or balanced approach is we live in the Twitter on steroids world, as I'll call it, where a YouTube event can drive, a double-digit drop in your stock overnight. So there's got to be some coherency and a lot of integration, both at a strategic as well as a tactical level for corporations. But what is this? The other kind of phenomena going on within the states is decoupling, which you may or may not have heard, but it's basically where an IOU gets paid for not selling their product. And it's a really interesting formula, and I'd love to get paid for not selling my product, but couldn't quite get on that bandwagon. But I think the point there is, as you extrapolate these type of social programs that are trying to re-engineer preferable sources of generation, or in this case, preferable sources of efficiency, you'll start seeing the lever of utility political power becoming less and less over time. I had a wise friend of mine that used to intervene in utility rate cases. He said, if you live by the regulatory sword, you die by the regulatory sword. And I think some of the recent acquisitions that you've seen with Southern Company and Duke getting into the natural gas business literally is kind of the canary in the coal mine, right? But let's, what is this lower carbon world kind of going to look like in the United States? And here's a chart kind of showing prices in Europe as well as other countries. And one of the things I want to point to is the non-energy costs, the kind of first green line item, the non-energy cost as a percentage of the integrated retail purchase price. And then I'll point to Germany. Let's see, do I have a little pointer? Nope. Oops. If you look at Germany, you see that their non-energy components of their integrated retail price is about 74 cents. 74%, excuse me. That's actually 141 euros per megawatt hour, about $151 a megawatt hour. But 74% of that component cost is non-energy related. Now, the other end of the spectrum, you look at Turkey, that's running about 85 euros per megawatt hour, a little over $90. The non-energy cost is only 27%. And I'll kind of leave it to you which world you'd want to live in, because Germany's been quite aggressive with the renewable programs that they have, and so taxes have been fairly significant within their country. But at a wholesale level, commodity prices tend to be driven by market fundamentals, the supply and demand, and structural factors. So congestion, supply mix, that sort of thing. But the non-energy components typically are driven by government and regulatory policy. And we're seeing this trend already if you've charted some of the different states and ISOs in the US, where that non-energy component is growing to be more and more of a customer's cost. And we think that trend's going to continue. And here's a chart just kind of averaging some of the impact, where in Europe mainland, you're seeing about 60% of the total energy price for electricity is a commodity component, and then the other 40% is made up of those non-energy components. And right now within the US, 60 is about the number where our average ISOs are. But yet you see a just almost relentless focus on the supplier margin, which is like 2%. And I think that's because it's an easy lever to pull with an RFP to try to get supplier margin down, but yet global corporations are having a harder time doing some of the structural changes that they need to have done to be able to deal with some of the other non-energy components of their bill. And all of this new dynamic is going on while companies are reducing costs, reducing manpower. There's a squeeze on global profitability, squeeze on market share. There's tight capital availability. Energy projects now are having longer paybacks because energy is relatively cheap. The compliance costs, both on carbon as well as energy legislation, is increasing, and continuing to protect corporate brand value and reputation in the sustainability world is getting increasingly hard. And the point of all that is that energy needs to have a seat at the corporate boardroom so that you've got deep subject matter expertise in the energy world, the implication of regulatory governmental changes in the energy world, and then the rationalization of some kind of strategy, both on a global basis as well as a plant-by-plant kind of specific basis. But one of the other dynamics you have in corporations is you've got parochial self-interest of individual stakeholders, where at the very top, for example, you may have Axle Plant, who is the buyer at a site, and his vested interest is the viability of the plant and the profitability of the plant. And at the other end of the spectrum, you may have the sustainability head that has different goals, different objectives, and if KPIs and the overall focus and direction of the corporation is not aligned completely, you can have a spot event that totally destroys any brand value that the corporate sustainability executive worked to put together. And all of these competing objectives lead to an organization like this, where you have vertical silos all separate, not talking to each other. Well, you have demand engineering and production that'll have different goals and objectives. You'll have procurement that may or may not involve risk management that's trying to buy based on inaccurate production data. And then you've got sustainability at a corporate level that doesn't know what's going on at the individual plant. You got everybody competing for capital dollars as well as operating dollars to try to affect a certain outcome. And without all of these different functional and business units aligned, you get a mess. Again, at a corporate level. So key considerations in looking how to reorganize global corporations for the future include agree on a level of centralization and time scale, and this will probably be somewhat fluid as we move forward in the future. Investigating the existing strategies that the plant, the region, the division, the country, as well as the corporation are pursuing, and do they make sense in light of this new future? Agreement on ideal responsibility matrix and governance model. Who makes the call, when these competing objectives come together? All of this has got to be tied in with corporate social responsibility objectives and requirements. And then, of course, at the end of the day, the hedging strategy, budget setting, price controls, and some of the tension that comes in between those. And then lastly, drafting group policies with local flexibility that lets the country managers make some nuanced decisions that are most certainly going to have to be made based on knowledge of the ground. So at Accenture, when we go into organizational design of global corporations, we create something that looks like this, where we're redirecting their structures to literally be able to think globally but act locally. You have all the energy stakeholders aligned to support the field operations in achieving their long-term objectives while enhancing brand value. The concept of teaching the elephant how to dance takes on new significance in this world. And of course, putting a plug in for Urginet, it all gets down to data and getting accurate data, timely, and delivered in the right form to the right decision makers. So, in summary, what we see global corporations doing is centralizing to reduce costs, coordinate compliance, and speed optimal decision making. For example, a clear and coherent definition of risk and risk management. An example that we've worked with a client on, you may have a 3-year fixed price in a US market, in a German market, for example, that's considered an asset and valuable, but in Sweden it could be a liability. And your corporation needs to be able to share all of those global best practices as you go along. Need a clear definition of procurement KPIs. We talked about where a sustainability goal may favor a longer-term strategy with some renewable generation resource, whereas the plant strategy may conflict with that if the plant buyer or plant manager is held to annual KPIs of year-over-year savings. Best practices identified by individual businesses or lead engineers, plant managers, need to be transferred digitally around the world. So there's free flow of information sharing. Energy efficiency measures and operating planning needs to take into account the overproduction or overcommitment on the buy versus what you're actually consuming. And then most importantly, again, in this Twitter world we're in, public statements on green energy have to be backed up with data and with practical solutions. Eliminating duplication and cost of data collection. When you look at most energy managers in the US, much less around the world, and even facility managers, there's a lot of vertical siloed systems that don't talk to each other. They don't share data. So there's multiple databases, several iterations of collecting the same type of data, those type of things. Global, country, regional regulation compliance needs to be coordinated to optimize the outcome. And then lastly, you want to optimize the investment in energy efficiency measures and distributed versus either utility or large-scale renewable sourcing.